Okay, today we get to talk about existentialism more broadly. And part of me wants to sit and just compare and contrast secular existentialism with Buddhist existentialism, with Christian existentialism. Some students have shared their opinion with me. It's like Buddhist existentialism splits the difference between secular existentialism and Christian existentialism, because Buddhism, as you know, is often practiced or can be practiced as a philosophy rather than a religion, whereas Christianity, I guess, could be practiced as a philosophy more than a religion. Maybe. So, but what's interesting is secular existentialism, as we'll get into, is often atheistic and in some ways fails to live up to its own assumptions. So we'll have several rambling monologues about this on video. So be sure to look up under the Files tab, be sure to look up the lecture on existentialism. So it's under Lectures under your Files tab. So James, who is walking in right now to have a seat, was teasing me the other day that as he reads existentialism, it seems like so much, what was your word, gobbledygook?
Old man sitting around reading poetry.
Old man sitting around reading poetry, which to him was a criticism, but to me is high praise.
A little bit of both. It was just confusing.
There we go. Okay, so let's make the confusion worse. Because confusion can be extremely profitable and deeply informative. Holy cow. Okay. So how is it then? That confusion can be deeply informative. One of the things that confusion allows us to do is to return to the process itself. That we can get into what is confusing us and wonder about it and explore it and see the many options and possibilities there are with that particular thing. Whether it be somebody that you just met or an existential psychologist or anywhere in between. So one of the key words to really begin to wrap your head around with existential psychology is the word being. Now, earlier in the semester, we talked about hermeneutic interpretivism, or just interpretivism. And that is this notion that we are beings in the world with other people and alongside things. And that being is not only a subjective, but an intersubjective event. So, we experience being. We don't necessarily reflect upon it very often. And this is where the poetry feeling can come in. Is these poetic and philosophical writings are often a matter of trying to reflect upon things that we don't normally reflect upon. For example, when was the last time that you sat and reflected upon your own consciousness? Where you paid attention to the facticity that you were thinking, what you were experiencing, and all the things going into experiencing your life in that particular way. And so, being comes from Heidegger's phrase Dasein. It means being there. And again, this is a review for many of you, because you were in class when we talked about this, or go watch the video on that. And that is that we are sharing the same context from multiple different points of view all at once. For example, I'm sitting on this end of the table, on this side of the camera. James is sitting on that side of the camera, on the other end of the table. I'm experiencing what's behind him, the rest of the dining room, the pantry, the kitchen, and he is experiencing this end with the whiteboard and the stacked up games behind me, etc. So there are two ways to emphasize this. One is the shared nature of context, that James and I are experiencing this particular monologue in this particular way at this particular time from two different points of view. That there's a shared emphasis on being. That being is something that we are experiencing together from different points of view. And that's the way the Buddhists and the Christians take up the word being, is they tend to emphasize the contextual sharedness of being. They tend to emphasize the way in which we are all in the world. In fact, in Buddhism, for example, they talk about interbeing, the way it is that all people around us are thickly or thinly a part of who we are and a part of our experience, as well as our environment is a part of our experience. Now, I realized last time I didn't define what I mean by thickly or thinly. Think of it as to a large degree versus to a small degree. Even then that's not quite what I mean, but it's a place to start. So if I am sitting down and I'm having a conversation with another and they're deeply informing my experience, then they are thickly a part of the experience I have of being in relation at that particular time. If I am standing outside in the cold and the cold is getting into my bones and I'm shivering, then the environment is thickly a part of what it is I'm experiencing in the cold. Right? Thinly, though, sometimes somebody's trying to talk to me and I'm minimally conversing back to them, then they're only thinly a part of my shared experience of being. So what's very interesting, though, to contrast secular existentialism, is the psychologists who read existential philosophy tended to read those philosophers that were more interested in our unique experience of being, our particular subjectivity, our particular point of view within this broader context. And so they take the sharedness of context and they make it more radically perspectival. So I have my perspective on what's going on. James has his perspective of what's going on. You have your perspective on what's going on. That the three of us have different perspectives, and they tend to emphasize the individual perspective within this context, okay? Now, think ahead in terms of consequences to that particular assumption. Does that mean that secular existentialists are more likely to be individualistic, given that they privilege our unique subjective point of view? And so another way of looking at this, actually, I'll just be very blunt. Because many existential psychologists already assumed individualism, they tend to read this philosophy in individualistic ways, from an individualistic lens. And so the way they take up Dasein emphasizes the individual's perspective and experience within the context, and they de-emphasize the context itself.
Right, but in that same token, it seems very communitarian, because you just talked about a shared perspective and a shared being. We're all being on our own individually, but we're also being in a group context.
Right, and that's why it's a matter of emphasis. That's where the Christian existentialists and Buddhist existentialists really emphasize the communitarian values, etc. We're all in this together. We're all interbeings. The secular existentialists, though, already assumed individualism when they started reading these old man philosophies, as you put it, and so therefore they tend to emphasize and prioritize the individual experience within the shared being. And to be fair, though, there are some existential thinkers, like Sartre, for example, tends to talk about people more individualistically. Nietzsche, at times, tends to talk about us more individualistically. And these are some of the philosophers that undergird psychological existentialism. So, the question becomes, what happens when we are out of touch with being? Given that most of the times we really are out of touch with being. And there's a word that we use in existential psychotherapy called alienation. And that is where the words that we use and the words that we create lose legitimate authority over us, or take over us in ways inauthentic to what they are. So I know I just evoked the term authenticity. I'll need to define that here in a minute. For now, though, the way that this term alienation arose, I'm thinking Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, for example, both of whom were critics of religion, and both of whom shared some concerns, and their concerns simultaneously differed. Kierkegaard, for example, was very much a theist. He very much was a devout believer in Christ, in that whole Christian thing. And he was also a scathing critic of Christianity at his time during his day. Nietzsche was an atheist rather than a theist, and he was also a scathing critic of churches, not only just churches, but also governments in his day. And so one of the things that we find, how it is that people are alienated, or the term alienation itself comes from, is from these two philosophers, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, who are criticizing religion from two different points of view. So I'm going to give several examples of alienation to try to give you a picture of it. There are two forms of alienation, roughly, when it comes to its origin, religiously speaking. One is the way in which people participate in religious ritual in a way that has no meaning for them. It's not affecting them, it's not transforming them, it is something that you do because that's just what you've always done, or it's because what everybody else does. So you go to church on Sunday because that's just what you do. You take your sacraments because that's what you do. You listen to the Mass or the lectures or the sacrament meeting speakers because that's just what you do. You're not transformed by it, you're not changed by it, you're not having an experience of it. Likewise, think of somebody who is, say, in a Latter-day Saint context, teaching and all the things that they're not saying because of the cultural assumptions about what you say at church and what you don't say at church. So, recently there was a general conference for the LDS Church, for example, and there was a speaker who told a story about, Uncle Joe and how the kids learned to love him, and Uncle Joe was so touched by the outpouring of concern. Even though he'd been indifferent to religion his whole life, Uncle Joe was the subject of a lot of blessings and help, a lot of love when his diabetes got so severe and he became very sick, and then he joined the church and then later died, and he died peacefully, and what a beautiful story. And then the speaker, in an offhanded way, says, and at times things don't turn out like that. Okay, that's a lovely and nice acknowledgement. Imagine hearing that, though, when you were a missionary. Like, one of the missionaries that I worked with back in Indiana, so if you guys remember, I became something of a couples counselor for missionaries there, that one of them facilitated the name removal of 25 members and baptized 2. So he went home to Oregon at a negative 23 in terms of his missionary experience. Because we had lots and lots of people on the rolls, people who were in opposition to the religion, people who didn't want anything to do with the religion. And so we went through, and me and the missionaries met with, oh my gosh, over 100 men, and said, okay, would you like to still be a member? And those who, for example, met us at the door with a shotgun, it was very fun because the degree of alienation that we experienced. Like, one man was threatening to shoot us, this missionary and I, and then at the same time, when we said, would you like to have your name removed, threatened to shoot us even worse. He was like, he went from threatening violence to actively screaming at us, right? So he doesn't want anything to do with the religion and is violently opposed to us showing up at his door. But then when we said, would you like your name removed from the records, that way we won't bother you anymore, he became even angrier still, right? There's some kind of disconnection he has with his faith that shows he might be alienated from it in some ways, where he goes through his daily motions of pretending that he's a member of this particular religion, or it's in the background noise, it's the white noise of his life. But when it becomes focal, he gets very upset, either that it's intruding in his life or that he is asked to have that part of his white noise removed. Okay, so kind of a double alienation. Likewise, the church is extremely boring for many churches. That rather than churches being a place that are inspiring or helpful or supportive, etc., instead it's 500 people in a building or 100 or 20 people going through the motions. That there's not a lot of things going on there that are transforming each other's lives. And so now, on the other hand, some of you are saying, but I've seen that happen. Yes, and that's when you're not alienated from the religion or when somebody else isn't. That there are people who go very intentionally, very mindfully, very deliberately, and they go to help create an experience, not have it given to them. That shows rather the opposite of alienation. So, two forms of alienation. Form one, we walk through our religious life as a zombie, right? We're not really tuned in, we're not really mindful of it, we don't really participate in it, we're not helping make it be the experience that it is, you're just going through the motions. On the other hand, there's another form of alienation, and that's where people get so enthralled by a given dogma that they stop meaningfully being a part of it. Instead, they have their particular narrow point of view of it, and that narrow point of view of it becomes what it is to the expense of all it actually is. So, I've teased before that there are people who, for example, will study their religion, Catholicism, locally, Latter-day Saintism. I'm told that Mormonism is no longer politically correct. And they'll find that these religions have all sorts of skeletons in their closets. Some downright atrocious things have happened. And therefore they lose faith in their religion. And then I chuckle because then they'll go on to get master's degrees or doctorate degrees in psychology. Psychology is much newer in an organized way than either Catholicism by far or Mormonism a little bit. At the same time, though, psychology has a lot of really dark skeletons in its closet that aren't taught in your Psych 1010 or your abnormal psychology textbooks. You need to pretty much be an advanced scholar of the history of psychology to find all of psychology's pretty horrible, rotting skeletons. So, a recent example. I've had many experiences in the past 10 years, 11 years, where I will know somebody and I will know them as a devout member of a Christian religion. So evangelism, Catholicism, etc. And they take their religion up in a very narrow and very particular way. They follow the rules they believe that they are given, they read the books according to the interpretations they are given, and everything is very constrained and very narrow. And they're all in, church every Sunday, etc. And then, many of these people I know lose their faith, so to speak, and they then will come to me with the writings of Dawkins and Hitching of the God Delusion, etc., the writings of the Four Horsemen, the atheist Four Horsemen from psychology and other sciences, and they'll do the same thing with those writings. Again, it's very narrow, that they're all in, it's very particularly interpreted, that just like a fourth dimensional thinking within religion could have been very helpful for them, likewise fourth dimensional thinking in their atheism would also be very helpful. They go from one rigid dogmatic overinterpretation to another rigid dogmatic overinterpretation. Neither are actually authentically in relation with the thing itself, whether religion or atheism. And so that's also alienation, that they were alienated from their faith. They're very complex, their religious faith of origin, which is very complex. It's full of contradictions and some paradoxes and some dishonesties and humanities and everything else. And then likewise, now they're in an inauthentic relation with atheism, with its same thing, with its humanities and its inconsistencies and its consistencies and things like that, that they just keep trading one extreme for another extreme, but the point is they're extreme rather than really relating to the thing itself. So, so that's two kinds of alienation. Do those make sense, James?
Yes.
Okay. So one is where you're just kind of swimming through the motions of your life, like a fish in water. You're not really paying attention to the water, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it be your religion, your job, whatever else. But because these phrases started with criticisms of religion, Then the other one is to be extreme. Like, think of the people you know that refuse to hear criticisms about their religion or about their dogma, right? And that their position is actually a very brittle one. It seems very hard, but like the Tupperware plate versus a Corelware or ceramic plate, right? One is harder, but much easier to break.
I had a conversation with a used to be Latter-day Saint, now atheist guy that focused on about 5 elements that he saw that were flaws in the church, and that was his testimony as to why the Latter-day Saint religion was not valid. But if those 5 things were dissected, he would continue on the conversation and then revert back to those 5 things as if they'd never been dissected in the first place.
Oh, kind of circular?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what's fun though is having known people have made that faith transition, they do that same circularity when they are religious as they do when they're irreligious. And so part of what an existential therapist would do is make them uncomfortable, right? In fact, one of the things I chuckle at is when you read existential therapy, it's they use similar methods to the Christians, but in a very atheist way. Where if you're comfortable, existentialists like to make you existentially uncomfortable. But if you're uncomfortable, like if you're really suffering, depressed, or anxious, then they're very comforting. So it's like they convict to the comfortable and then comfort the uncomfortable. And that was the whole message of Christian evangelism from for like 2,000 years now. So it's quite fun to see this. So there's an extension of this in terms of psychology and psychotherapy. When we parrot the thinking of others, like our favorite theorist, without doing the hard thinking we need to do, then we're alienated from our own capacity to reason, right? That one of the reasons why I teach fourth dimensional thinking is because, well, these reasons and others, is how do I be mindfully a part of a given system of practice and belief in psychology and psychotherapy while still being critically aware of its flaws and trying to magnify its strengths and minimize its flaws. Like, rather than just dogmatically quoting Joseph Smith, Christopher Hitchens, instead, to what degree are there limitations in this form and style of thinking, and to what degree are there limitations in this form and style of thinking, to what degree are there strengths in this form and style of thinking, and to what degree are there strengths in this form and style of thinking. So, another example of alienation before we move on to a very important term, which is authenticity versus inauthenticity. So, trigger warning, some of you may need to fast forward a few minutes. I'm about to tell a graphic story. My colleague Dave was a therapist for a man who was convicted of rape. And I had the privilege of consulting with Dave on this particular case, about this particular man. And seeing the video of the rape was very disturbing. The video was grainy, it was in black and white. Even then, it was still sufficiently detailed that it was clear what was going on. So, image, sideways on a bar. There's a door here, a bar here. Not ping pong.
Pool?
No. 2 little buttons, flat paddles.
Pinball.
Pinball. So there's a pinball machine here, and then some little standing tables, a bar. It's a long, thin bar this way, okay? And there's a woman there with 7 men. She's not with them. In fact, she's flirting with one of the men, or trying to, but she's very intoxicated, and the man doesn't seem interested. In the frame, it's silent, but in the frame, the bartender looks at them and gesticulates at all of them, indicating it's closing time, and there are things he needs to do, and so he's telling it's the last round, I'm going to go clean up in, behind the bar, back in a back room. You guys see your way out, and I'll come out and lock up. So the bartender was familiar with these people. Then as the frame proceeds, the woman stands up to try to leave, and is needing to use various pieces of furniture, bar stools, the bar, the standing tables, to make her way to the door. And as she gets to the pinball machine, she falls down against it. Well, one of the men that she hadn't been hitting on lifts her up against the pinball machine, pulls her underwear down, she was wearing a skirt, flips her skirt up, and proceeds to rape her. He's then talking to the other men, and although you can't really see their facial expressions because the film was too grainy, and most of them had their back turned to the camera, which was on the other end of the bar, there is some kind of egging on posturing, so by the time the video is over, all 7 men had penetrated that woman as she's on semi-conscious on the pinball machine. And so as they leave, the woman is still in the pinball machine. The bartender comes out, sees her there, goes over and tries to talk to her. Her skirt is still up around her midsection. And so there's the bartender clumsily trying to arrange her skirt, and then he lays her on the floor, and then he goes, and apparently he checks the video, because the video cuts out at this particular time. And then he calls the police. So he reviewed the film, wondering why in the world this girl's skirt is up, and then sees what happens. She does not have the capacity to consent. And so the police are called, and all 7 men are arrested. Well, they were tried separately for reasons I still don't understand. Legal rather than tried as a group, they were tried individually, and several of them were convicted of the rape, including Dave's client. And so Dave's client, from day one in the prison, said, "I'm not a rapist, I don't belong here, I shouldn't be here." And so this went on. He was suicidally depressed. This was ruining his life, right? It was unjust, it was unfair. And Dave encouraged him to sit and watch the video and then break it down for him. Like what happened, what meaning this particular man assigned and addressed with this particular rape. And Dave noticed a change in his demeanor pretty radically. So he was able, it took weeks of course, but he was able to get from his lawyer a way to view this particular video. He watched the video. For some reason it wasn't shown at trial, or at least the defendant, this particular client, didn't see the video when it was shown in trial. It was unclear to Dave, and it's unclear to me, because usually evidence is presented with the defendant right there. Regardless, when he sat and he watched the video, his discourse went from "I deserve to die because I'm not I want to die because I'm not a rapist" to "I deserve to die because I am." Like he stopped to be alienated from the meaning of what he had done, right? That he had that re-encounter with that videotape, and that changed radically his thinking. Now, from an existential therapy point of view, this is a problem. This is serious business, but it's a better problem to have, right? It's better to have somebody catastrophically suffering over what they did do, and they're no longer alienated from it, and they get it, than trying to work with somebody who is clueless about what they've done. Now, in a more G-rated way, think of the people that you know in life who are hurtful and offensive and refuse to take personal accountability and responsibility for it. Okay? Think of those people. And when you try to interact with them, they might be sorry that you feel that way, but they're not doing anything to change their own behavior. So, and anytime you try to help them get insight about it, they keep focusing it back on you. And this is a much more difficult problem to have than if you go to somebody and you say, "Hey, here's what you did, it hurt and offended me," and they take accountability for it. "Oh, I'm so sorry, what can I do to make amends? I will endeavor not to do that around you ever again." That their guilt or that shame in that particular moment is actually a better problem to have in that relationship than somebody who keeps hurting and offending you over and over again and blaming you for it, or being indifferent to changing their own behavior, demonstrating a lack of insight. So, authenticity. There are 2 ways when we read psychological existentialism to take up the word authentic. They're related and a little different at the same time. So let's start with the way that psychological existentialism, or in this case secular existentialism, talks about authenticity. So authenticity is being who you are. Being really who you are, understanding who you are, what your attitudes, attributes, capabilities, possibilities are, and then being that. and pushing against or ignoring anybody or any part of society that tries to tell you who and what you are. So that's authentic. Heidegger, for example, who's one of the fathers of secular and psychological existentialism, back in the 1930s would wear what he called his existential suit. And so it was a very colorful, it was particularly not colorful as in multicolored, but it was like this mauve or maroon suit that very much stood in contrast with his peers at the German university. He would wear this half cape quite dramatically, and then this top pointed hat like a fez, and he would wear that around confidently, etc., as a way to demonstrate that he's being his own authentic self, that the standards of dress, the standards of society, that he was choosing his own path, his own way. And so psychological existentialists like pointing that out, that you need to be who you are. You do you, boo, like you be your special self. And it's really empowering when we're helping clients who are used to being oppressed and therefore alienated from their culture, from their religion, from their lives, and we help empower them to have a voice, to speak their authentic voice regardless of what other people think, then it's very empowering. That's a very strengthening particular form of therapy, is helping people get in touch with who they are and then to help them express it. Now, double bonus, there is a particular form of individualism we discussed early in the semester. Can you ferret out which form of individualism these particular existentialists emphasize? So if you remember, there are a couple. No, there are more than a couple, but the couple that we discussed. So that's one way of thinking about authenticity. Authenticity being you've got to express yourself, you've got to be you, and culture and society will do what it can to push you and force you and try to constrain you to get you to be back like a cog in the economic or religious or educational or political scheme. That instead you got to break away. You no longer be a cog in that machine. You got to be the super special princess pony snowflake that you are on the inside, and you've got to live that. So that's one way of talking about authenticity, okay? Less commonly in the field of psychology and psychotherapy, there is another way of talking about authenticity. This form of authenticity is where you are you in relation to others. And so it's less radically individualistic, and in fact it's more relational or even more communitarian. And this is where, when I'm reading like the Christian therapies and the Buddhist therapies, this next way is the way they tend to emphasize authenticity. And that is, I am being in relation with an other, and it is very helpful for me to get in touch with my thoughts, my feelings, my drives, my desires, etc., as well as acknowledging the way in which this is unfolding in relation with an other. Okay? So they are a part of my authenticity. For example, I have 2 children left at home, and two biological kids left at home. And these particular biological children are a part of my being a dad. I notice that if I am authentically trying to relate to both of them, there are very similar father styles I have with both of them. At the same time, though, they're pretty different. With my son Jareth, I'm much more likely to grab him by the shoulders, give him big hugs, noogies, etc. I call him little because he's only like 6'3", and so he's a little dude. And I love teasing him in that particular way. I'm more likely to ask him to cook and praise and thank him for his cooking because he's a really good cook. And more likely to do various like video gamey, role-playing game things with him. Whereas Diamela, we tend to have more philosophical conversations. So that's my daughter. And I'm less I don't think I've ever given Diamela a noogie, like grabbing on the top of her head. And they are a part of my fathering. Now, what's interesting is authentic to the individualist interpretation of authentic might be inauthentic to a relational version of authenticity. So because I am a rather exuberant and expressive person, that there are a lot of if I go up and I grab Diamond around the neck, put her in a headlock and give her noogies, I can say, well, that's just me being a dad and that's just who I am, right? And that might be authentic in the individualist sense of authenticity, but to the relational sense of authenticity, that might be inauthentic because my daughter wouldn't appreciate that. She doesn't like being handled in that particular way. She likes being related to far more gently. And so that's this lovely contrast between those two styles of inauthenticity. So therefore, what is inauthenticity? Inauthenticity varies depending on which particular assumption we have about authenticity. So if it's secular psychology, secular existential psychology, inauthentic is where we are allowing culture, economy, politics, religion, etc., dictate who we are, and we are a slave to those. Okay, that's inauthentic, is where you live your life through other people's eyes always. You don't actually just take ownership of who you are and live that accordingly, irrespective of the eyes and opinions of others. Whereas inauthentic to a relational existential therapist, and they're very rare, but a relational existential therapist, inauthentic means that you are either allowing the situation to dictate you fully, or you are being you in a way that does violence or does contextual damage or is less contextually ideal. So I wear these shirts and I wear these shorts and I teach in them and I have for years. And part of that is the existential demand for authenticity. And one of the things, though, that a relational existentialist gets to wonder is what that unfolds in my teaching relationships. For example, our former senior vice president of academic affairs, we have since moved to a provost model at our university, but our senior vice president of academic affairs is a man I deeply respect. And he and I didn't always agree. He and I didn't always see eye to eye. I felt frustrated and would meet with him on occasion about some of my frustrations about the way he handled problems. I jokingly referred to him as a frenemy, like he's a friend and an enemy on certain political topics at the university at the same time. And one day, Dr. Olson, when he was still relatively new at the university, sees me in my t-shirts and shorts, etc., wandering campus. And I was also in executive meetings with the leaders of the university. And so one day he just comes up and he says, you know, you would seem far more professional if you would just dress more professionally. And I shook his hand and thanked him, and I said, and then I would take all of the advantages and disadvantages that brought. I'd rather take the advantages and disadvantages of dressing how I do. You know what I mean? And I say, if you are worried or if you become mindful of ways in which my dress is disadvantageous in terms of how it negatively affects my teaching more often than positively, then sit down and meet with me and I'll reconsider some of this. So it may seem like I'm like Heidegger, right? Just, hey, screw you guys' opinion. I wear what I want. You guys, it doesn't matter. But at the same time, it's mindful and deliberate. And if it is a problem, there are certain t-shirts, for example, I don't wear on campus anymore because they were a problem. And I could see the problem unfolding. A t-shirt that now one of my foster daughters has, it says, suicide pays off only once, homicide pays off over and over again. And and I wore this before school shootings became a thing, but as school shootings became a thing in this particular society, then a colleague of mine, I'm kind of embarrassed that a colleague had to point this out, that the context of that meaning meant from just an ironic, dark sense of humor to a statement that's actively threatening. And so, therefore, authenticity, one, I keep wearing the shirt because I think it's funny. So that's the individualistic sense of authenticity. The relational sense of authenticity is, I like having a dark sense of humor, but I'm not threatening anyone. So therefore, I don't wear that shirt anymore, and now my daughter does, and it's hilarious. So, because when you're working as a tattoo artist and you're wearing that shirt, it fits. When you're a university professor standing in front of 500 students in a crowded Psychology 1010 lecture hall, not so much. Okay, so questions about the two senses of inauthenticity before I move on? No, it's clear?
Seems pretty clear.
Okay. And so one of the things that we get to do for those of us who are interested in the more fourth dimensional therapies, like Buddhist therapy, Christian therapy, existential therapy, we're going to talk about Gestalt therapies, these more fourth dimensional therapies, is our assumptions become more lively and we get to own them, or we need to own them more readily in a fourth dimensional therapy, right? So you'll notice with authenticity, inauthenticity, those who are individualistic going into existentialism have a place within existentialism as a matter of emphasis. Those who are more communitarian, more relational, as they're coming into existential therapies, they tend to have their space within existentialism as well. And so that's true for all of these different theories that we've discussed that are more fourth dimensional. Okay, so to wax Nietzsche-esque, what informs us becoming authentic, given that we have a world that oppresses us at every turn? And that's will to power. I love this phrase. It's hyphenated, if you'll notice in your notes. Will -to -power. Will to power. Thank you, Nietzsche. This is the human's fundamental capacity to be self-creative and hence authentic. You'll do better if you base your lives on who and what you are with the entirety of your being. So will to power is your will to be who you really are. And anytime you live without becoming who you really are, then there will be consequences in terms of depression, anxiety, anomie, lostness, listlessness, that there are a lot of problems in our society that are due to people failing to live up to their will to power. So this existential guilt we'll talk more about later in the unit. So imagine living your life according to everybody else's preferences but your own. So much so that you will even tell yourself that their preferences are yours. That there will always be a part of you, these Nietzsche argues, that will be lost, that will always be despairing or feeling guilty. Now, guilty doesn't necessarily mean I've done something wrong. Instead, you can even feel guilty about who and what you are as a person. Imagine carefully monitoring your thoughts, where you feel guilty even about the thoughts that you have. How would that be? Oh, I can't think that way. God judges you even for your thoughts. Or I can't think that way because I'll start acting that way and then I'll get in economic trouble, I'll lose my job. Or politically, I need to very carefully edit what I'm thinking in order to continue to fit in with the political views of my particular family or my particular friend group or neighborhood. So the will to power is the part of you that is always saying, no, be a being, embrace your being, be who you feel you are, begin to speak the voice that you have, stop oppressing yourself, and start standing up to your oppressors. And there's a real revolutionary vibe in these writings, where so many societies rely upon us uncritically going with the flow on what we are given, societally speaking. So imagine what would happen in our society if people just quit buying stuff. If people just bought what they needed rather than what they wanted. Like I sit and chuckle because at my battle station downstairs where I enthusiastically play my video games, I've got two monitors. One's like 27 inches and the other one's like 55 inches. I don't need this, right? And so how much of the lives that we live in particular are driven by this capitalist need to consume, right? That we are a part of that. In fact, this is a tangent, but it relates. I used to be a news junkie, where I would watch the BBC, MSNBC, CNN, etc. And then when a certain political figure got elected, it was too overwhelming for me. And so just the discourse around that, not the person necessarily himself, but that plus all of the discourse around, that there was a sudden, even more than usual, lack of clarity, politically speaking. And so there was a debate about whether to, during the COVID-19 pandemic and quarantines, whether to end the quarantine in order to save the economy, or to persist in the quarantine to save some lives, but at the detriment to the economy. And I loved the discourse. I made the mistake of checking the news right as that discourse was unfolding, and it was black and white thinking, very second dimensional. And I felt very sad, and then closed the news channel. Because in our society, we have become so subject to the dollar bill that money is health. If we kill the economy, we are killing people. How many people could have gotten life-saving preventative treatments in advance of their condition becoming acute and deadly if they could have just afforded it, right? And so the discourse between, if I go back to work, or you telling me I have to go back to work and that kills grandma, or there's the other side, we've got to save the economy for the children. They're both right? I don't know about for the children, but they're both right, that those who are economically disadvantaged are already at a higher risk of mortality than those that are wealthy. You know what I mean? When we in our various classes, when we criticize psychological and medical science, one of the things we point out, like, I love green tea. I've got a big cup of green tea mixed with some juice right here. It's one of my favorite drinks. And I would joke that, all these studies come out that show that people who drink green tea live longer. Well, ironically enough, I know that wealthy people like me are more likely to drink green tea than poor people who are more likely to drink soda, right? That means I have access to health care. I do have my personal physician's direct number. Those are some privileges of wealth. And some of you say, well, Matt, you're a university professor in the armpit of Utah, nobody ever thinks about. Yeah, UVU doesn't pay well, but I'm comfortably middle class, right? That gives me access to resources that I wouldn't have if I were still working, breaking big rocks into small rocks for minimum wage in the hot sun like I did in college, right? That therefore I am more likely to be healthy. My blood pressure is managed, etc. What does this have to do with will to power? Everything. Imagine being able to see yourself as subject to the economy. How it is that capitalism has wormed its way into every aspect of your life. And suddenly you now have power to choose how you respond to that more so than ever before. For those of you that are raised in a very religious society, look at the way in which the religion has grown throughout all of your life. And before it was just dead and just there, and suddenly you become very culturally aware of how conversations happen and they're religiously informed. Like a colleague of mine's wife works at a local hospital. She's a nurse and a shift lead. Really? Time flew by that fast?
47:52.
My goodness gracious. But how it is that in the break room at work, it was like Relief Society. And when she pointed that out to the other nurses, they evinced shock. Well, no, it's not. But she would talk about what they talk about, how they talk about it, etc. It was a lot like we used to call them homemaking night. You know what I mean? And so when you begin to exercise your will to power, you begin to see how it is that politics and economics and religion and history and everything else is a part, that's sharp, is a part of who you are and what you do. And so what we will do is we will begin our next discussion on will to power, and then we'll get into other manifestations of existential psychotherapy. So for now, imagine if you're interested in existential psychotherapy, you might be the one who kind of nudges and helps provide insight or opportunities for insight for people to look at the way in which, sexuality and religion and economy and politics, etc., are a part of their lives, and help them exercise their will to power. So see you then.